Do you like high action poker games? If so, do not add a straddle. I repeat, do not add a straddle. This video will cover the top 5 reasons why adding a straddle to a poker game makes the game worse. Coming in at number 5, straddles are actually not an action producer. A lot of people get this wrong. They think that adding a straddle to a game is going to make players play loose with their money, play all sorts of hands, push the action to win that extra dead money. The reality is, in most casinos, what ends up happening when a straddle turns on is players tighten up. They become more conservative because the dollar amount is now higher on their bets. Plays that they might have made before, they're no longer making because they get tense and tighten up. Therefore, the straddle is actually not helping the game's action. It's causing players to go into a hole. Some players who would have raised previously, now they're limping. Some players that would have 3-bet previously, now they're just calling. The straddle is just leading to overall tightened play in most games that you find. Coming in at number 4, and closely related to reason number 5, you have to play tighter when the straddle is on. So actually, theory dictates tighter play if you are trying to play correctly. This is really unfortunate because casino poker is already fairly slow. There's 25 to 30 hands an hour. If we're not able to get in there with as many hands as we were previously, the straddle is actually hurting our experience because we're not playing as often. Having to tighten up because there's an extra player left behind us that hasn't acted yet, that has money invested in the pot, that's getting pot odds, is going to make us have to open a tighter subset of hands. We're going to face more 3-bets, which also forces us to open a tighter subset of hands. All of these things lead to a game that is not as rich as it otherwise could be. Coming in at number 3, small blind play in a straddle game is absolutely miserable. Everyone knows this feeling of being there in the small blind, somebody raises, somebody calls, and you're sitting there with the hand like Jack 10 suited, Queen Jack suited, pocket 5s, one of these pretty good but not great hands. These hands from the small blind are an absolute no man's land in a straddled game. Often the response is to squeeze, and that's what a lot of players default to. Theoretical poker in this spot in a straddle game is to strictly play 3-bet or fold from the small blind because you have 2 players left to act behind you. What happens so often is that players go for the squeeze only to find out that one of these 2 guys wakes up with hand. It happens more often than you think. Often your medium strength hands get punished because you're sitting there in a sandwich with absolutely no information on what's going on behind you. Plus, you're contending with the players that have already acted. Small blind play is always miserable, but it's almost hopeless in a straddle game. You'd almost be better off just like skipping your small blind, going to the bathroom, going to grab a snack, doing something other than burning your money and your time from this position in a straddle game. Reason number 4 is a big one. Stacks are getting shorter. And so a lot of players like to introduce the straddle to effectively double the stakes. And what should be happening if this is occurring, if everyone agrees, is the stakes should just double and people should add on to their stacks. Well, that's not what's happening in a typical live poker environment. What's happening is the stacks are remaining fixed. Meanwhile, the straddle is effectively cutting the number of big blinds that every player owns in half. So if a player buys in for 100 big blinds and now the blind amount doubles, they only own 50 big blinds. What is the problem with this? Cash game poker begins to approximate tournament poker. It begins to become a shorter stack game with less decision points and a smaller game tree. Now, why is that a bad thing? Some players like that. They like that it's simpler. They like that there are less decisions. It's less complicated. It's more like, say checkers than chess. The problem is edges begin to disappear once stacks get smaller and smaller. Take this to the logical extreme. If we went to say 10 or 15 big blind play, all of poker is already completely solved at this level. It's just push-fold charts. There's no decisions left to be made. It's just strictly following the chart, pushing when your hand is strong enough, folding when your hand isn't, and it's very monotonous in a very rote game. So we're moving in that direction already as we get stacks shorter. Now, we're not quite there when we're at, like, say, 50 big blind play. If someone bought in for 100, now they're down to 50. But the real issue is now hands like, say, ace-king offsuit, ace-queen offsuit, these kind of, big card hands that would ordinarily be put in a tough spot when faced with a 3-bet at a deeper stack depth, because they actually have to think. They actually have to feel it out, read the player, play poker, evaluate streets, play post-flop game. Now these hands at 50 big blinds can just indiscriminately jam all in, and they're not even making much of a mistake. We resort to more of a pre-flop game where anybody that has one of these big pair or big card hands can just get the hand in pre-flop now that we're in shorter stack territory. The game becomes more of a pre-flop game, less depth, less richness, less interesting spots, more of a solved game, which ultimately hurts the game and makes it less interesting and less fun. The final reason that I will talk about is the clear number one why straddles are bad for poker, and that is because players feel pressured. We have gotten to a place in poker where when you sit down for a given stakes, you have to also be prepared to play the straddled version of that stakes. Many players are not emotionally prepared for that. They're not financially prepared for that. They really just want to sit down at a game that is as it is advertised. What happens very often is that a player at the table, often an action player, suggests, hey, everybody, round of straddles. Okay, everybody does the round of straddles. It comes back around, and then the player says, well, let's keep it going. And it becomes almost this peer pressure thing where players have to keep going with the straddle or else they sound like the weak link at the table, the party pooper, the guy that just doesn't want to play either twice as big of a stake game, or another way of putting it is a halved game, a game with half as many big blinds. They don't want to be the player that speaks out and faces that vitriol from the group. At the same time, they really were not sitting down to play this particular game, so they're left in this weird spot. Guys, anytime that poker becomes more like a high school peer pressuring event, whatever event is leading to that is not good for the game. Some players would have actually never sat at the game if they knew it was going to be straddled, and now all of a sudden they're forced into something that they didn't want to do in the first place. Also, it makes it very hard for players to plan how much money to play with in the first place, because they just don't know what the stakes are going to be. They don't know whether to sit down or not. They're caught off guard. They don't know how much to bring to the casino, and the straddle ultimately leaves them somewhat high and dry. So anytime that we're creating an environment like this, we are potentially losing poker players. We want the game to be attracting people, to be fun, to be an atmosphere where people feel like accepted and that they can sit down and do what they're signing up to do, not one where they're immediately made to feel bad because the stakes double without their consent, and now all of a sudden they're left hanging there out on a limb, not knowing whether to get up and leave or to sit there with clenched teeth playing a game they didn't want to play. So there you have it, the top 5 reasons. Number 1 coming in as players just feeling pressured, not wanting to do something, and being forced into it by a group that thinks that this action is serving the rest of the game, thinks that it's creating action, thinks that it's creating actual game richness, when in reality, it is creating a condensed game tree, simpler decisions, and yeah, you're playing for more money, but you're playing with less big blinds in a spot that ultimately is trending towards more of a rote strategy, which is less exciting, especially as short stacks join the table. Now, the whole calculus changes if we've gotten to a point in the game where stacks have doubled, everybody at the table is deep, everybody's consenting to this type of stake change. Now, all of a sudden, we're in new territory. But the decision to do this right at the beginning with short stacks at the table is often going to be a detriment to your poker game. I know this isn't going to sit well with some action players that love the straddle, but ultimately sit with this for a little bit and see whether the straddle is actually making your game better or if you just think that it is.